Hello, it's Scott Manley here. It's June 21st. That is the summer solstice if you live in the Northern Hemisphere. The longest day of the year, or the shortest night, or flip that around if you're in the Southern Hemisphere. It's time for me to do another Deep Space Updates, and frankly, the delay has been terrible because, well, graduations, birthdays, construction. I've got my entire record collection just sitting out of shot there. It's kind of crazy. But we have to talk about the rocket launches. And the first thing that happened straight after the previous episode was we had Starship flight number 9, and it was more successful than flight number 7 or 8. The second stage successfully made it to its targeted orbit, and then immediately lost attitude control, tumbled out of control out of the atmosphere. But that was some progress until a few days ago. Regardless, I have a complete video on that if you want to examine the visuals or just discuss it. Worth watching. But also in the last few weeks, we've had 10 Starlink launches, and I'm going to combine those into one block. That's 5 from California, 5 from Florida. Notably, somewhere in there was the 500th launch of a Falcon rocket. Now, you could say successful or unsuccessful. It turns out both, right? The 3rd of June was the 500th flight of any Falcon rocket, including the Falcon 1, which had 3 failures, and there was a couple of Falcon 9s that failed. And then by the 13th of June, we had the 500th successful launch of a Falcon-class rocket. So anyway, plenty of Falcon 9 Starlink launches going on. But the really interesting launches start on May 28th with Tianwen 2 on a Long March 3B/E. Now, this is a Chinese mission to go to asteroids. So it's being launched to asteroid 469219 Camo o Alawea, I think. So this is basically going to do an asteroid sample return mission, much like Hayabusa and OSIRIS-REx have previously done. But this particular asteroid is very different. First of all, it is a quasi-satellite of the Earth. It is in a 1-to-1 resonance, and it sort of sits in this horseshoe orbit. So they're going to fly out to this. Now, an even more interesting thing about this, first of all, it's smaller than the asteroids Itokawa or Didymus that were... Wait, it's Didymus? I forget the name. Not Didymus. Bennu, that was visited by the previous asteroid sample missions. This one is only like, maybe up to 100 meters in diameter. This is not a big thing. It's also interesting, its rotation period is like less than half an hour. So this is a fast rotator, very likely a solid chunk of rock. And this satellite, this spacecraft, is going to attempt to sample some material from this. And it's going to, first of all, attempt an anchor and attach, where it's going to actually get to the surface and try to anchor itself to the surface so it can sample that. And if that fails, it's going to try some sort of touch and go mechanics. It's got all sorts of technology. And so it'll reach there in June of next year, perform the sampling, and I think it'll be like 2027 before it actually returns the samples to Earth. And then after that, the spacecraft itself, after dropping off the payload, it's going to swing by Earth in a gravity assist and kick off into deep space to try to visit 311P Pan-STARRS, which is a periodic comet about 2 AU out. Completely different payload. This is a very ambitious mission from China, and at least it has managed to get through the launch process. Anyway, moving onwards, 29th of May, a Long March 4B carrying a Shijian 26, which is, some sort of Sun synchronous orbit Earth observation spacecraft doing stuff for their government. 30th of May, Falcon 9 launched a GPS-3 number 8, nicknamed Katherine Johnson, of course, in honor of the late NASA mathematician even. So GPS-308 was originally supposed to fly on ULA's Vulcan, but because of delays in certifying it for national security launches, they sort of switched some payloads around, and Falcon 9 took this. So I think that there's going to be GPS-3F1, and that will actually switch over to the Vulcan. June 2nd, Electron Rocket Lab launched a mission called Full Stream Ahead from Mahia. This was the second of 5 launches for Black Sky Global, which has a number of observation satellites in sun synchronous orbit. They're doing the imaging as service thing. 5th of June, we had a Long March 6A launching Guowang. 5 of those communication satellites. It's basically like a Chinese version of Starlink. So that's the 4th launch. That means 20 satellites so far out of their planned 13,000. 7th of June, we had Falcon 9 launching Sirius XM-10 into geostationary orbit. And I believe this was one of the first times SpaceX have actually attempted to controllably deorbit the upper stage of the Falcon 9 from a geostationary orbit. That's just jumping into my head right now. Interestingly, by the way, that Sirius XM, it used to be two separate companies, XM and Sirius, and Sirius used to put their satellites onto tundra orbits, high inclination orbits, and XM put them onto geostationary orbits. Well, now the merged company is putting things into geostationary orbits because that makes more sense. 11th of June, Electron from Mahia launching a mission called the Mountain God Guards into sun-synchronous orbit. This was a QPS, synthetic aperture radar satellite, I believe number 11. So they're going to have 8 launches in this program for IQPS. Their total constellation will ultimately be 36 synthetic aperture radar satellites. Again, they are doing imaging or observation of the Earth as a service. 14th of June from China, a Long March 2D, launching a mission called CSES or Zhangheng. So this is a collaboration with Italy, a Chinese-Italian space mission. CSES stands for China Seismo-Electromagnetic Satellite. And this is supposed to investigate correlations between changes in the magnetic field, so the plasma environment in low Earth orbit, and seismic activity on the Earth. Is there any precursors to earthquakes, seismic events that can be picked up in the environment surrounding the Earth? Which isn't such a crazy idea. I'm really looking forward to see if there's anything that actually comes of this, because it would be nice to be able to predict earthquakes. Moving onwards, 19th of June, Angara A5 with a Breeze M upper stage launched Cosmos 2589 from Plesetsk. This is a satellite going to geostationary Earth orbit for Russia's strategic rocketry forces, military. So this is actually the first operational launch of Angara A5. It has a new longer fairing. With Angara now operational, that means they can really get to work finally finishing with Proton, which is, Kazakhstan doesn't like it, it's expensive, and it's ugly. So Angara A5 demonstrating that it's now actually a fully working rocket. And finally, 20th of June, a Long March 3B/E launching ChinaSat 9C, the replacement for ChinaSat 9 for China Satcom. It's a communication satellite going to geostationary orbit. Also, in the previous few weeks, there's been a suborbital flight for Blue Origin carrying 6 people who probably had a great time, enjoyed themselves, but since the flight didn't feature a world-famous pop star, nobody was getting mad on the internet out there discussing whether they're astronauts or not. Axiom 4 was also supposed to fly, but initially it was aborted after they discovered an oxygen leak on the booster. Now, this was a reused booster. It was refurbished after a previous flight. As they were getting ready, they did a test, a static fire on June 8th, and they decided to pull the mission because they needed to do further repairs and refurbishment on the booster itself. And then the launch was further delayed after there was some discussion as to the state of the state of repairs to the leaking sections of the space station. If you remember, the Zvezda module has a vestibule that connects to one of the docking ports with a Progress spacecraft. This has been leaking. Russia cosmonauts, they did some more repairs to it, and NASA was doing a wait and see to figure out whether this would improve the situation or not. But they now decided to give the Axiom AX4 mission the go-ahead. It should be launching on the 26th, so that's sometime in the next week or so. And we'll hopefully see those going up there, and maybe we'll get another cool re-entry coming back over the California coast when it comes back a few weeks after that. Over at Starbase, Texas, everything was getting ready for flight number 10 of Starship and Super Heavy. There was going to be a static fire at the Massey's test facility, and now, well, we've seen there's a whole lot of damage to Massey's test facility because the Starship exploded. Now, I posted a video straight afterwards speculating as to what went wrong. We could see that this was a failure inside the payload section at the top. I said it was probably part of the header tank system. We now got more detail. It's almost certainly a COPV, which failed. That is a composite overwrap pressure vessel. It's the way you make a light, high-pressure gas cylinder where you use a thin aluminium liner and then use carbon fiber composites over the exterior to hold the tension. And these are used in many places, but they've been implicated in 2 Falcon 9 failures, although, to be fair, one of those was the strut holding it, and the other one was they were putting it in liquid oxygen. They've since solved these problems, but these are new designs for Starship, and these COPVs are there to basically provide nitrogen for this fire suppression system, as I understand it, which means the fire suppression system failed to suppress the explosion which destroyed the rocket. Okay, so look, we can see now that one of these things probably let go. It would have severed the lines to the header tanks. We would have had liquid methane leaking out, spilling over the side. That then combusts. Then, as the vehicle begins to fall over, we get the bigger explosion from the main methane tank. At this point, I expect there will be a bit of an internal review, possibly a safety stand down. It did come to my attention that there was a SpaceX employee who had been pointing out that there was quite a lot of evidence of mishandling of COPVs by engineers on the ground who are working hard, but were not perhaps familiar with aerospace, and moreover familiar with how composites, when you look at them the wrong way, can go from being very strong to failing in unpredictable manners. And we've seen this in the past. We saw that when they introduced composite wrapped boosters for the Delta II. There's a very famous launch where the booster basically unzips, and it was all down to how the solid rocket motors were handled on the ground using a new trunnion system. They were rolling over rollers which were making pinch points on the surface, and that weakened the composite enough. Same thing could be happening here, where they're moving these things around, not realizing that if you put too much pressure on one point, you weaken it to the point that it becomes unusable. I expect we're going to see some more info on this going forwards, but this will be a problem that they will solve. I don't think that they're going to be launching as soon as we expected anymore. We had been seeing a possible Starship launch by the end of the month. It's not happening. I don't think they're getting to Mars next year, but there's higher priorities than that as far as I'm concerned. The big news in spaceflight has continued to be the state of affairs with the budget and the state of affairs of NASA appointees, etc. And yes, you've heard Jared Isaacman was pulled due to some internal stuff. Elon Musk apparently has fallen out of favor. There's been a war of words on social media, let's say, with Trump making some statements about pulling contracts and whatnot, and Elon making some other statements, including, by the way, alluding that the person that was responsible for kicking out Jared is actually a Russian asset. And that is sort of wild, but who cares about that? The really important thing, I think, to talk about is the state of NASA's budget. Now, as we all know, there was going to be massive cuts to everything. Well, don't worry. Ted Cruz is here. He's coming back with a new proposal to restore $10 billion worth of funding to the stuff we don't care about. He wants to fund SLS. He wants to put more money into the Lunar Gateway, into Orion. But actually, interestingly, it does include $700 million to fund a Mars telecommunications orbiter. It's a dedicated spacecraft to serve as a communications relay at Mars. And that sort of makes a lot of sense, and it would be part of a Mars sample return mission, except of course that's completely cancelled as well. And other parts of the budget still left untouched, so we're still expecting to cancel a whole bunch of still working space probes. We're not going to support them anymore. Well, only slightly less disastrous is Hakuto R. It attempted its landing on the moon. And it did actually succeed in landing on the moon. Unfortunately, it crashed going a little too fast. And the official word is, as of right now, that their laser rangefinder, their laser altimeter, didn't lock onto the lunar surface during a critical phase of flight. It took too long, and when it did lock on, by that point they were too close to the surface to actually slow down in time, and so they hit the surface going at over 100, maybe 200 kilometers per hour. Now, we're going to get another update later this week from that team, but since then we've also had imagery of the landing sites from Chandrayaan-2. They actually got there first with their orbital high-resolution camera, and the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter also got in on the act. And the great thing is we can put these side by side and see that the debris, what's debris and what's a hot pixel. And it's actually surprising, given the relatively low velocity, how wide the debris field has been. It is very clear there's one spot with most of the spacecraft, but there's a couple of chunks off quite a distance away. Now, while Hakuto R may not have had great success landing on the moon, well, Firefly, of course, landed Blue Ghost and gave us some amazing imagery. Now they're getting into the lunar imagery business. They're going to be flying a set of instruments in an orbiter, their Elytra spacecraft, in polar orbit around the moon, starting, I believe, next year. So they're going to have cameras. Some of the hardware is going to be built by the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. And supposedly, their imaging system will be able to get down to 0.2 meters resolution, which is like 50% better than the currently best hardware, which is the Chandrayaan-2 camera. They're going to be selling this. Now, there's a bunch of other sensors on board, but they're talking about selling this for, examining landing sites or doing mineral prospecting. There's a whole bunch of stuff, but this system is going to be called Ocula, and it's going to be like basically the first paid lunar observing system, which is pretty neat. Elsewhere, private spaceflight. There's been some big business news. First of all, Voyager Space decided to have an IPO. So this is the company behind Starlab. They acquired NanoRacks in 2021. So they went public on the stock exchange, on the New York Stock Exchange. The ticker is VOYG, not VGER, which, hey. And apparently on day one, the initial price rose from like $30 up to $56, but since then it's dropped back to about $45. Regardless, the company has made about $400 million, which is useful because they're going to be pushing forward with their development of private space stations. Elsewhere, Impulse Space, the company founded by SpaceX propulsion engineer Tom Mueller, they've got $300 million more via a Series C investment round, and that's on top of the $150 million they got for their Series B. They're, of course, developing their Helios and their Mira transfer vehicles. These are going to be high-performance, liquid-fueled Methalox systems that can take satellites up to geostationary orbit and potentially make the launches cheaper because you don't need to expend Falcon 9 rockets. They apparently, as of right now, have over 30 signed contracts and a backlog of $200 million worth of potential business. Dawn Aerospace, as I mentioned last time, they wanted to just start selling their Spaceplane instead of actually operating. Well, they have announced a contract which will see their little suborbital spaceplane flying out of Oklahoma, the Oklahoma Space Industry Development Authority. They're going to operate the Aurora Mark II from the Air and Spaceport in Oklahoma. And as soon as 2027, that's the magic number. So this is not like a big spaceplane by any means. It carries like a 6-kilogram payload on a suborbital trajectory. Right now, they've done test flights with this thing flying up to like 25 kilometers. Well, it's got to go, twice. It's got to go 4 times as high, which means it needs to go twice as fast. So we're going to see that in the future, hopefully. The agreement apparently is not quite the same as just selling the spacecraft. They're actually going to have some support, so it's like a $17 million contract. But it is the first. It's cool. Somebody's decided to go and buy a space plane. If that isn't sci-fi news, that's pretty, I don't know what is. Speaking of planes, by the way, it was the Paris Air Show this week, and Paris Air Show also includes lots of space-related stuff. And I think the thing that really stood out was the exploration company. And they have been working with the European Space Agency to create a re-entry vehicle, a return vehicle. They're planning like a mission to the International Space Station supported by the European Space Agency in like 2028. But they showed off their Nix capsule with seats inside it. And they said, we could develop a crew capsule for Europe for the cost of, however many billion euros. This is what they were pitching. I think it would take 10 years worth of development, but maybe Europe decides that it's finally time to get domestic human launch capability after deciding to do it and then not deciding to do it with Hermes. So if you remember Nix, they flew on the Ariane 6 launch last year, but unfortunately the upper stage, because it failed to relight its engine and deorbit in the correct place, they couldn't actually test the vehicle for it, perform its full re-entry test. The next flight of a exploration company capsule is called Mission Possible, And it's going to be tomorrow. It's going to be a 1.6 ton space capsule on the side of the Transporter 14 mission, which is launching out of Vandenberg. And it's going to go up, spend a couple of hours or 3 hours in orbit, and then it's going to deorbit and land in the Pacific Ocean. And hopefully we'll actually get some data from this flight. Other things that happened at the Paris Air Show that's sort of relevant is that Thales Alenia and Blue Origin signed like an agreement with the European Space Agency to basically look at flying ESA payloads and possibly astronauts on the Orbital reef space station. So this is, between Voyager Space with Starlab and Orbital reef, we're now actually seeing some real exploration of potential business models for private space stations, and not to mention VAST doing their thing. So yeah, we might well see Europe switching from the International Space Station to Orbital reef after the International Space Station ends its mission. Europe also, by the way, they had a really cool mission, which I talked about a few days ago. Proba 3, they finally published the first photos of this. This is a spacecraft pair which demonstrate the ability to fly in close formation with millimeter precision. They made an artificial solar eclipse that got closer to the corona, to the photosphere than any previous coronagraph. It's a very, very cool mission, and you should watch my video about it to get more details. And so I talked about next being on Transporter 14. Well, Varda Space, they're also going to be on Transporter 14. They're also going to be flying their return capsule, their Winnebago, which, by the way, of course, is a subtle reference to Spaceballs. And if you haven't been paying attention, Spaceballs 2, we get a whole teaser, like, crawl of text, which, well, I'm here for that. But yeah, the more interesting thing with Varda is the FAA said you can have a return license for the next 5 years, which means assuming they don't change the mission profile, they can just like tick a box and they've got their license to launch their Winnebago capsules into orbit, do their chemistry, do their drug manufacturing. They're currently making ritonavir, and then have it deorbit and land in Australia. And the FAA is not going to demand a whole bunch of paperwork for every single launch. That's great progress there. But Varda have now also moved to making their Winnebago spacecraft in-house. The previous ones were built in collaboration with Rocket Lab. Now they're building them at their own facility, and that's going to be great. So this is the fourth flight. They're going to fly up on Transporter tomorrow, and hopefully they're going to land successfully in Australia. Okay, over in Asia, we had a whole bunch of interesting flights, starting with Honda, who unexpectedly showed off the Honda rocket flying vertically and landing. So now this is a pretty small test vehicle. It's like only 6.3 meters tall, 83 centimeters in diameter. It went up 300 meters and it came back and it landed within 30 centimeters of its launch site. But this is it was also interesting because it took off from its landing legs, folded those landing legs up for the flight, and then it unfolded those for landing. It also had grid fins with, which were conformal, so that those would actually reduce drag when it was flying. There was a whole bunch of interesting technologies here. Also, the Honda had built their own engines apparently, and it looks like this is Methalox engines, cryogenic engines. It's really interesting that Honda talked about this, and they still have to decide whether they want to turn this into a full orbital launch vehicle. But they've said that if they do, their target is a 1.5 ton capable launch vehicle. And you might think, Honda, don't they make cars and stuff? Well, they also make jets. And in Japan, Mitsubishi, they make the H3 rocket. And the old Lambda rockets, those were built by Nissan. So this is not like unheard of for a car company in Japan to be building rockets. Now, over in China, we had a company called Seepoch, or Space Epoch. They're basically a Chinese rocket maker, another one. There's a liquid-fueled rocket which was tested just off the coast near the Haiyang spaceport. So this rocket was called the YXZ-1, or Yuan-Yingzi? Okay, it's a verification test. They flew it 2.5 kilometers up on its rocket engines and then had it descend and then land in the water. Now, they performed like a full controlled descent and then soft splashdown on the water. So this is another Chinese company getting into the launch and landing business. And by the way, at the Paris Air Show, Europe were also showing off their Themis plans. they're still on paper, while Japan and China are actually building working vertically landing rockets. We also saw China demonstrating the next generation of their crew launch spacecraft, the Mengzhou, which they had a pad abort test, right? So they had the capsule and its design, shape, and everything with an escape tower on top. It was propelled by a solid rocket motor, carried it upwards at great speed to escape potential, failure on the pad. Tower detaches, spacecraft reorients itself, deploys parachutes, lands softly on the desert with airbags. So, that's great. China are currently using the Shenzhou, and the Shenzhou is basically a slightly bigger version of the Vostok, which means, or not the Vostok, sorry, the Soyuz, which is actually a slightly better version of the Vostok, but never mind. China are wanting to move on from this borrowed, Russian technology and do their own thing. And so Mengzhou will be where they're going with this. Now, later this year, we are expecting to see a similar in-flight abort test of this. And finally, in China, Landspace performed a test of their Juche 3 launch vehicle. So this was a static fire. The Juche 3 is the successor to the Juche 2, which, as you know, is the first Methalox-propelled rocket to get to orbit. That was using their Tianwen 12 engines, which they had developed in-house. Well, Juche 3 is basically bigger. It has 9 engines generating about 750 tons of thrust. So this on the test stand, they performed a 45-second burn, including basic thrust settings, thrust variations, gimbal testing, just showing that they're basically moving this forward. And this will be much closer to what Falcon 9 or Neutron is capable of. Except that it's Chinese, and it's not one of the myriad of Chinese companies that are just taking solid rocket boosters and bolting them together to make a launch vehicle. Landspace is a serious contender in China. Okay, so that's the news and the things to look forward to. First of all, in the next few hours, you're probably going to see Transporter 14 launching from Vandenberg. As I said, it's going to have a bunch of satellites. It's going to have 2 re-entry capsules, at least. There might be more. So we'll be seeing a landing a few hours after that. We've also got Axiom 4 launching later in the week. Again, 4 crew members going up to space, led by Peggy Whitson, astronaut from India, who, of course, is part of the deal that was signed with NASA. And we'll be paying attention to all of that. But I'll see you around. I'm Scott Manley. Fly safe.